The sound came before anything else. Not wind exactly. Wind was a blunt instrument, a scouring thing that moved across surfaces and kept moving. This was different. This rose from the earth itself, from the torn cavity where the roots of a fallen pine had ripped free of the ground a decade before, and it moved through the curved bowl of exposed soil like breath through a reed, low and even, and strangely musical, as though the land were humming something it had known for a long time and was only now saying aloud. Clara May Hollis stood at the edge of her inheritance and listened to it. She did not yet know why it mattered. She only knew that it did. The sky above the northern Montana territory on that first morning of November 1883 was the color of old pewter. Not dramatic, not stormy, just the flat committed gray of a season that had already made up its mind. The wind that came down from the peaks carried something sharp inside it, the way a blade carries its edge, invisible until the moment of contact. Clara stood with her shawl pulled across her chest, not against the cold, but out of habit. The kind of physical gesture a woman makes when she is trying to hold herself together from the outside because the inside has stopped cooperating. She was 29 years old. She weighed, at that moment, 112 pounds, which was 11 pounds less than she had weighed on the morning James died. She had not eaten a full meal since the funeral, not because she was mourning in any romantic sense, but because grief had a way of making the body forget its own requirements, and she had not yet remembered to argue back. The land in front of her stretched across 10 acres of rock and scrub pine and general hostility. The town surveyor, when he had registered the original deed 4 years ago, had noted in his official record that the parcel was largely unsuitable for agricultural purposes owing to composition of soil and geological irregularity, which was the professional language for saying the ground was full of stones and the topsoil was thin as paper, and anyone who tried to farm it would fail. James had read that surveyor's note and folded it carefully and placed it in the back of his desk drawer where he kept things he disagreed with. He had a gift for disagreeing with evidence. It was Clara had understood early in their marriage both the most infuriating thing about him and the quality that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. The centerpiece of the property. If a thing that crushed the most promising soil beneath its mass could be called a centerpiece, was the corpse of a white pine that had been felled by lightning 10 years prior. It lay across the land like a continent, 120 feet from the torn root ball to the tapered tip, the trunk measuring more than 6 feet at its widest point. A long, dark scar ran its full length where the lightning had traveled the wood there, black and brittle and fissured, so different in texture from the dense, iron-hard surface of the rest of the trunk that they might have belonged to different trees entirely. The root ball, ripped from the earth when the tree fell, had taken a disc of soil 15 feet in diameter, with it leaving behind a wound in the ground, a semicircular crater nearly 8 feet deep. At its center, the walls packed earth, threaded with severed root ends, the floor a tangle of broken stone and compacted clay. Nobody had touched it in a decade. Nobody had wanted to. Clara had walked the full perimeter of the property twice in the weeks before James's debts had finished settling, while she had still thought there might be a way to save something. There had been nothing to save. The creditors had been methodical and without sentiment, which she could not hold against them. Sentiment was not a business practice. They had taken the furniture, the horse, the tools, the stored grain, the small savings account at the bank in town, the kitchen items she had brought from her father's house in Pennsylvania, the silver brooch that had belonged to James's mother. They had not taken the land because the land, as one creditor put it, while examining the deed with an expression of polite distaste, was worth less than the paperwork required to transfer it. So the land was hers. 10 acres that nobody wanted anchored by a fallen tree, that nobody had managed to use, sitting at the far northern edge of the territory where the winter came early and stayed late and came again before the frost had fully left the ground. She had a canvas tent that James had used on a prospecting trip 3 years before, a relic of another dream that hadn't paid out. She had a wood-handled axe, a crosscut saw, a shovel, a small kit of hand tools, and a canvas roll, $40 worth of supplies, beans, salt pork, hardtack, dried apples, lard coffee, and a composition notebook with a brown paper cover that she had bought at Earl Dunmore's general store on the way out of town. The notebook had been an instinct rather than a plan. She had stood at Earl's counter with her small pile of survival goods and seen the notebook stacked beside the ledger paper, and something in her had said, "You will need to write things down." She had not questioned it. She had put the notebook on the pile. Earl himself had said very little when he'd rung up her purchases. He was a man of 62, with a broad face weathered to the color of saddle leather, the kind of man who had seen enough hard winters to stop predicting outcomes. He had looked at her list of supplies at the stovepipe she had added at the last moment at the notebook, and he had said, "You be careful out there, Clara." Not careful in the sense of watch where you step. Careful in the sense of please do not die. She had told him she would try, and she had meant it. She stood now at the edge of that land with the humming of the root crater filling the cold morning air, and she thought about what her father had told her once standing in a stand of hemlock in western Pennsylvania when she was 9 years old and had asked him how he knew which trees to cut. Amos Reed had crouched down beside her and pressed his palm flat against the bark of the nearest trunk and kept it there a long moment before he answered. "You listen first," he had said. "You find out what the tree is doing before you decide what you want it to do. Then you figure out if those two things can be the same thing." She had been 9. She had not fully understood. She understood now. Her father had been a timber worker his whole life, not a wealthy one, but a skilled one, the kind of man who was called in when a job required judgment rather than just muscle. He had taught her to read grain direction in standing timber, to feel for the tension in a leaning trunk, to identify the difference between heartwood and sapwood by color and weight. He had taught her how to maintain an axe edge, the precise angle of the whetstone, the sound a properly sharpened blade made on a thumbnail. He had taught her these things without ceremony, the way you teach a child who is standing next to you while you work, which is to say through repetition and correction, and the occasional moment of watching her figure something out on her own without stepping in. When she had married James and moved to Montana, she had set all of that aside because James had his own ideas about how things should be done, and she had loved him enough to defer. She was done deferring now. James Hollis had not been a villain. She wanted to be precise about this, even in the privacy of her own mind, because the story of a dead man had a tendency to simplify in the telling, and she did not want to simplify him. He had been a man of abundant feeling and deficient arithmetic. He had looked at this 10-acre wreck of land and seen possibility, not the false possibility of wishful thinking, but something more specific than that, a vision of what the place could become. If you worked it right, if you understood what it was, offering beneath the surface of what it appeared to be. He had sketched plans. He had made lists. He had talked about the gently sloping ground behind the fallen tree, as future garden rows about the creek a quarter-mile east, as irrigation about the timber on the back 5 acres as building material or eventual sale. His plans were not crazy. His execution of those plans had been catastrophically underfunded. And his solution to underfunding had been to borrow from people who charged rates that compressed the timeline for success to something impossible. She had known all of this by the 2nd year of their marriage. She had known it and loved him anyway and tried to help in the way she could, which had mostly meant managing the household so carefully that there was no waste to speak of, which had mostly meant ignoring the growing weight of the debt she was not supposed to know, the full extent of which had mostly meant watching the man she loved carry something too heavy for him and refusing to put it down. He had died of pneumonia quickly in October, which had been a mercy in the clinical sense. He had not suffered long. Clara did not find this comforting. She found it abrupt. She would have preferred more time, even difficult time. She had not been given the option. Randall Hollis arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after the funeral, in a wagon so clean it announced prosperity the way a flag announced a country. He pulled it to a stop exactly at the property line and did not step down onto the land. She noticed this. The way a man positions himself tells you what he thinks the negotiation is before a word is spoken. Randall was 8 years older than James and inhabited that age difference the way a man inhabits a comfortable room with the easy authority of someone who has never seriously doubted his right to be there. He had James's eyes dark brown and direct, but where James's eyes had always moved with a kind of restless curiosity, always looking for the next interesting thing, Randall's were still assessing. He looked at Clara in her threadbare shawl and took in the canvas tent and the 10 acres of rock and the dead tree in the crater, and his expression moved through something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, settling finally into the businesslike neutrality of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and is now going through the formality of the conversation. Clara, I've come because it's the right thing to do. He cleared his throat in the way men clear their throats when they're about to say something they want to sound more generous than it is. This land can't support you. It couldn't support James, and he was a Strong's man who wanted it to work. I'll take it off your hands. $50 for the deed, enough to get yourself a room in town through the winter. Find respectable work come spring. For my brother's memory. She looked at him. She looked at the fallen tree. She looked back at him. Before you answer, Randall continued, something shifting in his tone toward the disclosure he had not planned to lead with, but had always intended to use. You should know I've already settled $30 of James's debt with Harmon directly. Out of my own pocket, because the Hollis name is worth something in this territory, and I wasn't going to let it get dragged through a public default. So the 50 I'm offering, that's 50 on top of what I've already put in. This is a generous offer, Clara, more generous than the land warrants. She understood immediately because she was good at arithmetic even when other people thought she wasn't. He had paid $30 to protect the Hollis name, not to protect James's widow, and he was now presenting that expenditure as part of a kindness he was doing her. The $50 was not an offer. It was a remainder. He was buying her out for what was left after subtracting his own interests. She did not explain any of this to him. She simply said no. The word came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw from weeks of minimal speech, but it did not waver. It landed in the cold air between them with a solidity she felt more than heard. Randall blinked. For a moment, the practiced composure cracked, and something genuine showed through surprise, then irritation, then the calculation of a man adjusting his approach. Be sensible. The first snow's 3 weeks out at the outside. There's no shelter here, no well, nothing. You'll freeze before Christmas. I'm not selling. You don't have... He stopped, tried again the facade of familial concern drooping at its edges to reveal the harder thing beneath. Fine, freeze then. Don't come to me when you're begging at the church door. He gathered the reins. Then, almost as an afterthought, but not quite, she would realize later, it was calculated that it was information he wanted her to have because he thought it would change her mind in the days after he left. There's a timber company out of the east that's been surveying this part of the territory. They'll pay well for standing timber. $500, maybe more, for the right parcel come spring. They'll deal with me, not with a widow who doesn't know how to value her own property. He clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved, dust rising from the frozen ground in small, pale clouds that drifted south and settled slowly in the still air. She watched him go. Then she opened the composition notebook and wrote the number 500 on the first page, and beside it she wrote spring. She walked the entire 10 acres that evening with the lantern held low, moving slowly enough to read the ground. This was something her father had taught her before she had words for it, the practice of learning a piece of land by covering every foot of it on foot at different times of day in different light. She counted her steps in each direction. She noted where the ground was rocky and where it softened. She followed the slight depression that ran east toward the creek, understanding from its path how water moved across the property after rain or snowmelt. She stood in the hinge of the root crater with the lantern off, letting her eyes adjust, and noticed that the air inside the bowl was noticeably calmer than the air 5 feet beyond its rim, The packed earth walls absorbed the wind's energy rather than deflecting it, and the semicircular shape created a pocket of relative stillness. She stood there a long time cataloging the sensation. The temperature inside the bowl felt several degrees warmer than the exposed land behind her. She did not yet know what to do with any of this. She only knew she needed to collect it. Back in the tent, she found the coat she had set aside when the creditors came, James's heavy canvas work coat, the one he wore in the field. She had held it back instinctively without admitting to herself why. Now she went through the pockets with the methodical thoroughness of someone who already knew on some level what she might find. In the inner breast pocket, folded into quarters, she found a piece of paper. She unfolded it beside the lantern. It was a sketch in pencil, light enough that the lines nearly disappeared in the yellow light. A rough shape she recognized as the root crater seen from above, with the fallen trunk extending from one side. Inside the crater, in the position where the log's end would have rested, a rectangle, small proportioned, clearly imagined as a room. No notation, no date. She had no way of knowing when he had drawn it or what he had been thinking, whether it was a serious idea or an idle one. Whether he had planned to tell her about it or had kept it back as one more thing he wasn't ready to say out loud. She refolded the sketch along its original creases and placed it inside the notebook, flat against the back cover. Then she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Below it, she wrote the temperature estimated, since she did not yet own a thermometer, and the wind direction, and a brief description of sky conditions. Then she wrote crater air warmer than surrounding land. Wind dissipated at rim. Investigate further. She fell asleep with the notebook beside her and woke before dawn, with the tense canvas snapping in a wind that had picked up overnight. And she lay in the dark listening to it and thinking about the way her father used to say that a tree doesn't fight the storm, it bends, and it bends according to its grain. And if you understand its grain, you can predict exactly how it will move. She was 36 hours out from the worst moment of her adult life, and she was thinking about wood grain. She decided this was probably a good sign. The first week was instruction by failure. She had expected difficulty, but she had imagined difficulty as a quantity of something, a large amount of hard work rewarded eventually by proportional progress. What she encountered instead was difficulty as a kind of argument, the land presenting a position she had to understand before she could respond to it effectively. The axe was the first lesson. She knew how to use an axe her father had made sure of, that had stood behind her when she was 10 years old and corrected her grip and her stance and the angle of her swing until the motions were automatic. But the pine she had grown up working with in Pennsylvania was green timber felled and used within a season, the cells still carrying moisture that softened the fiber and let the blade seat cleanly. This tree had been dead for 10 years in dry mountain air. The seasoning process had drawn every trace of moisture from the wood and replaced it with something close to mineral hardness. The axe did not sink. It rang against the surface like metal on stone and bounced back, sending a shock up her forearms that numbed her hands after 20 minutes and made them throb for hours afterward. She destroyed the first axe edge in 2 days. The second edge lasted 3 days, but produced barely a chip more progress. She spent an afternoon sharpening on a river stone until the blade would shave the hair from her arm, and then went back to the wood and found that a sharper edge simply failed more efficiently. The metal could not maintain contact long enough to cut because the rebound force was too great. She sat down on the trunk and looked at her hands, which had gone from blistered to raw to a rudimentary callus in less than a week. The progress on the wood was measurable in inches. Then the rain came. Not the gentle autumn rain of expectation, but a punishing cold-edged sleet that arrived overnight and did not stop for 18 hours. The tent had been adequate for 3 seasons in James's time, but adequate was not the same as sound, and the canvas had thinned, and the seam along the north-facing panel had separated in the cold. The sleet came through that seam in a steady trickle that soaked the blankets she had stacked on that side, soaked the supply sacks she had not thought to move, and knocked one of the tent poles sideways so that an entire corner sagged and pooled. She woke to water dripping on her face from the sagging canvas above and lay there for a full minute listening to it calculating the damage before she got up. The flour was ruined, absorbed water, and was hardening into a paste inside the sack. The dried apples were salvageable. The salt pork was fine. The beans were wet but could be spread to dry if the weather broke. She pulled on her boots and her coat and went outside into the sleet and spent the next 2 hours re-rigging the tent with rope and poles in the iron will of someone who has no alternative. And when she was done, the tent was still imperfect, but it would hold. She went back inside and sat on the dry edge of the bedding and looked at her hands, which were white with cold and shaking slightly, and thought with great precision about Randall's wagon pulling away and the $50 she had refused and the room in town he had offered. She sat with that thought for a full 20 minutes, which was as long as she allowed herself. Then she opened the notebook and wrote down what she had lost in the flood, what she had saved, and what she needed to replace, and at what cost. The arithmetic was not good, but it was not catastrophic. She could manage. She wrote tent must be moved inside root crater, lee side of root wall before next storm. The idea arrived 4 days later, not as inspiration, but as convergence. She was sitting inside the root crater with her back against the compacted earth wall, sheltering from a wind that was building from the northwest. And she was looking at the trunk of the fallen tree, looking at it the way you look at a familiar thing when you are too tired to see it the usual way, seeing its shapes instead of its meaning. The long scar where the lightning had traveled was directly in her sight line, the wood there dark and fissured. She had broken off pieces of that charred material with her fingers several times in the past week, almost absently the way you pick at loose bark. It crumbled easily. It was nothing like the granite hard surface of the untouched wood. Her father's voice unprompted the old-timers used to work boats from a single trunk. No mill, no frame saw. They burned the inside out slow and careful and scraped the char while it was still warm. Takes patience. Takes knowing exactly how much fire is enough and when to stop. She looked at the scar. She looked at the untouched wood. She looked at the scar again. She built the first experimental fire that afternoon, small no larger than what she would use to cook a meal positioned against the exposed heartwood where she had been attempting the axe work. She used dry pine needles and small twigs to bring it up slowly, then fed it chips of bark until she had a steady, low-controlled heat. She did not let it build. She kept it hungry rather than satisfied, a persistent lick of flame rather than a burn, and she tended it for 4 hours, adding fuel in small increments and watching the surface of the wood rather than the fire itself. When she doused it with water carried in a bucket from the creek, the surface was black with a layer of carbonized wood a 1/4 inch deep. She picked up the adze, a curved blade tool her father had used for shaping timber, which she had kept when the creditors came because it had his initials stamped into the handle, and she had told them it was sentimental and not worth anything, which was one of the few lies she had told during that process. She set the blade against the carbonized wood and swung. It bit. Not a chip, a chunk, black and light as coal, pulling away from the surface and falling at her feet. She swung again. Another chunk. The adze was doing in 2 minutes what the axe had failed to do in a week. Her breath came fast, not from exertion, but from the particular feeling of a theory becoming fact of something you hoped was true, demonstrating that it is. She worked until the light failed. The cavity at the end of that first productive day was perhaps 8 inches deep and 14 inches wide, minuscule, against the scale of what she needed to accomplish, but real, measurable, undeniable. She pressed her palm flat against the wall of the cavity and felt the warmth still radiating from the wood, the deep stored heat of the burn. For a moment, she thought of her father placing his palm against the hemlock bark. You listen first. You find out what the thing is doing before you decide what you want it to do. She did not mark the moment with anything ceremonial. She allowed herself to sit for 10 minutes doing nothing, which for Clara May Hollis, in that period of her life, was as close to ceremony as she got. The third burn 6 days into the new method nearly ended everything. She had grown more confident, which meant she had grown less precise about the conditions, which meant she had not accounted for the wind shift that came off the north face of the mountain in the early afternoon, a phenomenon she would later understand as entirely predictable given the thermal patterns of the terrain, but which she did not yet understand at all. The wind changed from west-southwest to north-northwest in under 3 minutes, and the fire, which had been burning calmly in a position she thought was sheltered, suddenly had the wind at its back. The flames moved across the trunk toward the dry tinder accumulation of bark and sawdust and wood chips she had piled to the side over the past week. She threw the water bucket. She had one bucket always kept filled at the fire site on the pile, which slowed the spread but did not stop it. She looked at the fire and she looked at her options, and her options were the tent, which was canvas, and would make things catastrophically worse, or the earth which she could not move, or the canvas tarp she had rigged as a windbreak on the south side of her work area. She grabbed the tarp, pulled it from its poles in two sharp motions, and beat the flames with it. The tarp caught along one edge, a section roughly the size of her outstretched arm, and she had to drop it and stamp out that edge before resuming. It took her 11 minutes to get the fire fully under control, which she knew because she counted her heartbeats in groups of 10 to keep herself from panicking into uselessness. When it was done, she was standing in a small circle of black scorched ground with a tarp that had a hole burned through one corner and two raw patches on her right forearm where she had not gotten out of the way fast enough. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the creek, filled the bucket, and poured it slowly and deliberately over every piece of the work site. She walked the perimeter of the burned area 3 times, checking for ember. She went back to the creek and filled the bucket again and poured that too. Then she sat down and looked at her burned forearm and thought with great methodical calm about every variable she had not controlled and exactly how to control it. Wind direction monitor continuously pause work at any shift. Fuel accumulation, move chips and sawdust downwind of fire, site after every session, maintain minimum clearance of 8 feet. Water supply 2 buckets minimum at site, not 1. Fire boundary pack a ring of wet earth 6 inches wide around the perimeter before lighting. She took the needle and thread she used for clothing and repairs and mended the burned edge of the tarp. Then she opened the notebook and wrote down every rule she had just made. She added at the bottom, the wood is not the danger. Inattention is the danger. The burns continued. The cavity grew. Earl Dunmore appeared on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November, making his weekly supply run to the scattered homesteads on the northern road. He stopped his wagon at the road's edge and stood looking at the scene before him with the expression of a man watching something he cannot quite categorize as disaster, but cannot quite categorize as anything else. Clara was standing in a cloud of char smoke, her face blackened to the cheekbones, her hair wrapped in a strip of cloth to keep the sparks out of it, her forearm wrapped in a strip of the same cloth over the burn that had not fully healed. The hole in the side of the tree was by then 4 feet deep and wide enough to stand in with one shoulder touching each wall. Clara, his voice came out, careful the way you speak to someone you are not sure will hear you properly. What in God's name are you doing, building my home, Earl? Her voice was flat with exhaustion, but precise. He stood there looking at the blackened cavity, at the mountain of char chips and wood waste outside it, at the tarp with its burned corner, at the carefully maintained perimeter of wet earth around the fire site, taking in the evidence of method even through his alarm. He was not a stupid man. He could see the difference between chaos and a process he didn't understand. But he also could not square what he was seeing with any framework of reasonable behavior he had for a 29-year-old widow in late November. Child, this is madness. His voice was genuinely kind, which made it harder than Randall's had been. That's a grave you're digging. The winter will take you. There's still time. I can talk to Reverend Mills. We can find you a place to stay. Nobody would judge you for it. She bought a sack of beans from him, a tin of lard, 2 pounds of salt, and a length of stovepipe. The stovepipe made him go quiet for a moment longer than anything else. He understood what it implied about her intentions. He gave her the goods with the look of a man who has said his piece and knows it didn't land his face carrying the particular resignation of someone who cares enough to be troubled, but respects enough to step back. After his wagon was gone, she heard in the distance the sound of the cold morning air humming through the root crater again. She added the stovepipe to her inventory list in the notebook and kept working. The news spread the way news spread in a small territory through Earl, who told what he had seen without embellishment, which was the most efficient possible way to make it travel far. Within 2 weeks, she was aware that she had a name, not Clara Hollis, not James Hollis's widow, but the Pine Woman, which some people said, with a kind of grudging acknowledgement, and others said the way you say a word you're not sure is polite. Children came to the property line and shouted things and ran. She heard them distantly from inside the log where she was working with the adze and trying to determine the extent of a crack she had found in the ceiling of the forming chamber. The crack was a problem. She had noticed it first as a surface feature, a line no wider than her thumbnail running along the grain about 3 feet in from where the chamber wall met the projected ceiling. She had probed it with a whittled stick, pressing it as far as the crack allowed in various positions, and the results were not good. The crack ran at least 8 inches deep, possibly more, and followed the grain direction in a way that suggested the split might be structural rather than superficial. If she was right about its depth, and if the chamber extended under that section of trunk as she had planned, the weight of snow on the roof could cause the ceiling to fail inward. She stopped all digging work for 2 days. She ran scenarios in her mind with the same patience she applied to fire management, not catastrophizing, just working the problem. She poured water along the crack and watched how it moved, which told her the direction the grain ran at depth. She tapped along the wood with the bark of the adze head and listened to the difference in sound between solid wood and potential void the way her father had taught her to test standing timber for hidden rot. She mapped what she found in the notebook with a rough sketch. The conclusion she reached was conservative shift. The chamber positioned 2 feet toward the root end of the trunk away from the crack section entirely. This meant abandoning approximately 5 days of completed work. She noted this in the notebook without annotation, not because it didn't sting, but because annotating it would not make the 5 days come back. And she had spent too much of her adult life in the company of men who annotated their losses at length instead of adjusting to them. Hector Burns arrived with Earl on a Thursday in early December, which caught her by surprise because Earl had not mentioned bringing anyone. Burns was 68 and moved with the deliberateness of a man whose joints had opinions about the cold, a broad-shouldered timber worker's build, gone slightly to rest with hands that were an architectural record of 40 years of metalwork and wood handling. He said nothing when he got out of Earl's wagon. He walked the perimeter of her work site with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at everything without touching anything, his eyes moving with the systematic sweep of a craftsman doing an inventory. He looked at the burned perimeter rings. He looked at the water buckets, 2 of them now positioned on opposite sides. He crouched stiffly and examined the packed earth berms she had begun building in front of the root crater entrance. He stood inside the entrance to the root crater itself, where she had rigged the tent as a temporary windbreak, and turned slowly in place, taking in the semicircular walls of packed earth, the flat section of creek stone she had laid across the floor to test drainage behavior. Then he walked to the entry of the log chamber and bent to look inside his breath, making small clouds in the cold air. He stayed crouched in that position for a full minute. When he straightened, he looked at Clara with an expression that contained no pity and no alarm and no condescension, just the professional appraisal of someone who has seen a lot of construction and can distinguish between an amateur's mistake and a method he hasn't encountered before. The floor, his voice was unhurried. You need a drain course under those stones, flat creek stone over loose gravel over a channel that runs out the low side. Snowmelt in spring will come up through the subsoil if you don't give it somewhere to go. And with a structure like this, what you can't see will do more damage than what you can. He paused. 2 days now saves you a decade of problem. He described the dimensions and placement with the economical precision of a man who has explained physical systems enough times to know which details matter and which don't. He did not offer to help build it. He had given her the principle. The application was hers. When he straightened fully and turned toward the wagon, he said one thing more to the air in front of him rather than directly to her. "That's not a bad piece of thinking, what you're doing here." He climbed back into the wagon and Earl drove them both away. She spent the next 2 days on the drainage course. She got it right on the second attempt. She noted in the notebook burns correct on all specifications. Retest with creek water before freezing. Randall came back in the second week of December. She heard the horse before she saw him, a single rider, not a wagon moving fast. He pulled up at the property line in the late afternoon with the sky behind him going from gray to a deeper gray that meant the temperature was about to drop. He looked better than he had in November, which meant his affairs were in order, which meant he had a purpose here that went beyond familial obligation. He had heard from a contact that the timber company's interest in the region was firming up. The standing timber on the rear of her parcel had real value now, not speculative value. He came with a new number, $200. Not the 50 of November, a figure that acknowledged she had something worth acquiring. He looked at what she had built, and his face went very still. The chamber was complete, 8 feet wide, 10 feet in length, the ceiling a curved shell of pine wood that she had smoothed with the wire brush until the grains showed through the black and reddish-brown waves. The drainage course was in. The floor was laid with flat stone from the creek. She had begun the berms on either side of the root crater, packing excavated earth and stone into low curved walls that extended the shelter outward, and the shape of the entrance was beginning to read as intentional as sunken courtyard, protected on 3 sides open to the south. She led him to it without speaking, because he had not yet said anything that required a response. He looked into the chamber for a long time, the way he might look at something that was offering him information he had not prepared to receive. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved methodically across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the drainage knot she had cut at the low corner. He understood physical craft. He had built his own farm from raw land. He could not dismiss what he was looking at as ignorance. She said, "You see a hole in a dead tree. I see a home. We are looking at the same thing." He turned from the chamber and looked at her instead, looked at her the way he had not looked at her in November when she had been simply a problem to be managed. Something had shifted in how he held himself. He did not name it, and neither did she. $200, he said. "That's a real number, Clara. Enough to start properly somewhere." She waited a moment then. "Are you going back to town tonight or riding through dark?" He understood. He rode through dark. She watched him go and then went inside the chamber and ate cold beans from the pot and added an entry to the notebook. Randall 200 offered, declined. Timber company confirmed, spring timeline confirmed. Assess options when relevant. She finished the structure in the first days of January, working in the last window of weather before the serious cold settled in. She fitted the door from salvaged planks hung on 2 iron hinges she had purchased from Hector Burns's shop through Earl. She seated the small pane of glass she had found intact at an old dump site 3 miles east. A piece of luck she had not planned for, had simply noticed while walking the creek line, and had carried home wrapped in her coat. She packed every joint and seam with a mixture of clay and dried moss, pressing it in with her fingers and smoothing it flat. She hauled the stovepipe through the log's upper surface, sealing the penetration with a careful ring of clay and rock packing, testing it twice for seal before she was satisfied. The canvas tent she had dragged over the exterior of the log as an additional wind baffle and snow break pinned in place with stakes. The night she lit the stove for the first time with the door sealed and the window in its frame, she sat on the bed of pine boughs and held the thermometer and waited. 40 minutes after lighting, the interior temperature crossed 60 degrees. 50 minutes it crossed 62. An hour 65 and climbing. Outside the thermometer she had rigged on a stake near the root crater, showed 12 degrees Fahrenheit. She sat with both numbers for a long time. The arithmetic of it, 53 degrees of difference achieved with 4 pieces of wood and a stove that weighed 40 pounds inside walls, that had cost her nothing but time, was not yet real to her, in the way that things you have worked for are sometimes not real at the moment they finally arrive. She had understood the principle. She had trusted the principle through 2 months of doubt and failure and cold and pain and the accumulated weight of everyone else's certainty that she was wrong. Now the principle had become a number, and the number was 65, and 65 was warm. She wrote it in the notebook. Date, interior temperature, exterior temperature. Wood used, time elapsed. She wrote it the same way she had written every other entry, precisely without comment, because the data said what it needed to say without her editorializing on it. Then she heard the wind moving through the root crater outside, the low, even sound that she had stood listening to on the first morning of November, the sound she had not yet had language for. She knew now what caused it. The curved geometry of the root bowl created a resonating chamber when wind moved at a specific angle across its rim, and the northeast winds hit that angle on most clear mornings. Physics, acoustics, the exact kind of thing her father would have explained calmly while demonstrating it with whatever was in his hands. She listened to it longer than she needed to. She had understood it for weeks. She went on listening anyway in the warm interior of the home she had built, from the two things everyone in the territory had agreed were worthless, while the temperature outside dropped toward zero, and the season finished making its mind up, and the winter that was coming turned out to be something none of them had encountered before. Something that would test every assumption the valley had built, its certainty on every assumption except hers. The Great Freeze did not announce itself. That was the thing people would say afterward, in the way survivors always identify the absence of warning as part of the injury, as though the storm owed them notice, as though catastrophe was supposed to arrive with its name on a card. What came instead was a week of ordinary cold, the kind that settles into a valley in early January and is unremarkable, followed by 3 days of unusual stillness. The air going flat and odorless in a way that the oldest residents of the territory would later say they had felt before once when they were young but had not trusted themselves to name. Then the temperature dropped 16 degrees in 4 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky sealed over with clouds so low it seemed to press on the rooftops, and the snow that began falling at dusk did not stop for 6 days. Clara recorded all of it. She had been keeping her temperature log every morning since November, but in the first week of January, she began recording twice daily, morning and evening, because the variance between the readings was telling her something she wanted to understand. The exterior stake thermometer outside the root crater entrance became difficult to read. By the third day of heavy snow, half buried, and she had to excavate a small channel to it each morning before taking her reading. She did not find this inconvenient. She found it informative. The depth at which the thermometer sat relative to the snow surface was itself data. Inside the chamber, on the morning of January 9th, 63 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 pieces of wood used overnight. Outside, 4 degrees below zero. The numbers sat in adjacent columns in the notebook, and the gap between them, 67 degrees, bridged by pine wood packed earth and snowfall that had become, without her asking it, to a perfect insulating blanket across the roof of her home, was the most complete sentence she had written in months. She ate breakfast. She read. She mended the left knee of her work trousers, which had developed a thin spot that would become a hole by spring if she left it. She heard the storm outside as a muffled constant, not the sharp edge of wind she associated with exposed cold, but something lower and more total, the sound of weather that has settled in and is not in a hurry. Earl Dunmore in those same days was fighting his stove. He had 2 of them, the main iron range in the kitchen of the store, which he also lived behind, and a smaller pot belly in the front room where he kept the merchandise. The pot belly was the problem. Its chimney pipe ran through an exterior wall rather than up through the roof, and the cold had gotten into that wall so thoroughly that the pipe was conducting cold inward faster than the fire could push heat out. He had packed rags around the pipe penetration in early December, and thought that would hold. It had not held. By the third day of the freeze, he was feeding the potbelly continuously, and the front room was still cold enough to see his breath, which meant his stock, the tins of goods, the seed packets he had in back, the medicines that could not freeze were at risk. He moved everything he could into the kitchen. He did not sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. Hector Burns in his smithy at the edge of the South Road was the calmest person in the valley during the freeze. His forge ran hot by professional necessity, and the structure he had built around it over 40 years of small adjustments, a low-ceilinged room with thick log walls he had chinked twice in the last decade, a sleeping alcove separated from the forge room by a single heavy curtain, was not elegant but was deeply functional. He did not worry about Clara because he had looked at what she was building and understood that it would work, and once Hector Burns had formed a conclusion from physical evidence, he was not in the habit of second-guessing it based on atmospheric conditions. Margaret Hollis, wife of Randall, was afraid for the first time in her adult life in a way she could not manage by being practical about it. She was a capable woman, had run a household, raised 2 children, managed the books for Randall's operation through years of varying harvests, and done it all with the competent equanimity that was the only version of femininity the territory truly respected. What she did not know was how to sit inside a house that was supposed to be solid and feel it failing. The sound the roof made on the 4th night, a repeated low creak, rhythmic like something testing a joint, was the sound that broke through her practical composure because she could identify it. She had heard that sound before, once in a barn that had come down under an ice load 3 weeks later. She lay in the dark beside Randall and listened to it and did not tell him what she was thinking because she knew what he would say and she knew he would be wrong. By the 5th day of the freeze, the Hollis farmhouse was in active retreat. The kitchen pipe had frozen in the wall overnight, not just reduced in flow, but sealed the water inside turned solid in a section they could not access from inside the house. The shingles on the north face of the roof had let in a thin horizontal line of weather at the ridge invisible until the attic floor showed a dusting of snow. Randall had gone up and packed the gap with rags and tar paper and come back down with ice crystals in his beard and his face a color that Margaret recognized as fury, unsuccessfully suppressed. The wood supply was the calculation that could not be made comfortable. He had stocked well by any normal measure more than any other farm in the valley because Randall was not a man who cut corners on preparation. But 2 fireplaces running at full capacity in a house that had been designed to be handsome rather than insulated were eating through that supply at a rate the normal winter would not have produced. He had done the arithmetic 3 days into the freeze and had not shared the result with Margaret, which told her everything she needed to know about what the result was. On the morning of the 6th day, he sent Will, the young farmhand who slept in the barn loft, to check on Clara. Not because Randall had developed sudden concern for his sister-in-law's welfare, though he would have described it that way if pressed. He sent Will because he needed to know whether there was another functional household within reach. Any functional household, and Clara's was the nearest. Will pulled on every layer he owned and set out into the snow. The walk took Will 90 minutes in each direction. He came back with snow compacted into every crease of his clothing. His eyebrows white, his words coming in short bursts. Between the effort of warming back up, there was smoke from the stovepipe. There was lamplight in the window. The entrance, the sunken part in front, the part that goes down into the ground, was shoveled clear. Recent work, the edges sharp. It looked, he said, with the bewilderment of someone reaching for a word that fits like a place where someone was living normally. Randall sat with that for a long time at his kitchen table. The 2 fireplaces audible in adjacent rooms, the sound of the house working too hard present in every creak. Margaret was in the parlor with the children, all of them under blankets, keeping still to conserve heat, doing a lesson from memory because the ink had frozen in its well. The arithmetic of his wood supply was a fixed number. The temperature outside was a fixed number. The rate of consumption was a fixed number. These 3 fixed numbers, arranged in sequence, produced a conclusion that his pride had been arguing with for 2 days. He put on his coat. He put on the second coat over the first. He wrapped his face in wool and pulled his hat down and went to the door. And Margaret's voice came from the parlor, steady with the effort of being steady. Be careful. Not where are you going. Not take Will with you. She knew where he was going. The 2 miles between the Hollis farm and Clara's land took him 3 hours. He had expected difficulty. He had not expected the specific physical experience of moving through a blizzard at full force, which was not like walking in heavy snow, but like trying to move through a medium that had opinions about direction. The wind came in waves, each one a full-body pressure that required him to stop moving and lean into it, then a pause of relative calm that he learned to use efficiently, then another wave. He fell 4 times. The third fall was on a slope he had crossed in summer 100 times without thought, and he went down hard on one knee and stayed there longer than strictly necessary breathing before he got up. He found the property line by the fence posts. He remembered from his November visits the wire between them, invisible under the drifts. From the fence line, the walk to where the house should be was perhaps 100 yards, but the landscape was unrecognizable. Everything was white and featureless, the usual markers of terrain buried under 4 feet of uniform snow. He stood at the fence line and looked and found nothing that read as structure, nothing that read as built. Then he saw the smoke, a thread of it, nearly horizontal in the wind, rising from a point that seemed impossibly low to the ground, from what looked like nothing more than a long white mound, slightly more regular in its contours than the surrounding drifts. He moved toward it because there was nothing else to move toward. The entrance to the sunken courtyard was visible only as a depression in the snow surface, a slight geometric regularity that his eye caught from 6 feet away. He went in thigh-deep at the first step the snow had drifted across the entrance and pushed through it, feeling for the stone floor with his feet, until the packed earth walls of the root crater rose on either side of him, and he was standing in a sheltered corridor, the wind cut off above him. The door was in front of him, set into the end of the log. He could feel warmth even before he reached it, not imagined warmth, but physical warmth, the kind that registers on exposed skin as a change in the air's character. He knocked with his gloved fist. He knocked harder, the sound swallowed by the storm behind him. He was preparing himself in a specific and unexamined way for the door to not open, for what the alternative would mean for the task of forcing the latch, and what he would find. The door opened. The wave of warm air was a physical event. It struck his face and the exposed skin of his neck and the backs of his hands where his gloves had ridden up, and the contrast between it and the air he had been moving through for 3 hours was so complete that he felt his eyes fill not from emotion, but from the involuntary physiological response to sudden warmth after prolonged cold, the body's emergency systems standing down all at once. He blinked it clear. Clara stood in the doorway in a wool dress, a single layer, no shawl. Her face was composed. Her cheeks carried the mild flush of someone who has been warm for a long time. She was not shivering. She looked at him the way you look at something you expected, but had not set a precise time for. She stepped to one side. He went in. She closed the door. The sound of the storm did not diminish. Gradually, it stopped completely between 1 second and the next, replaced by the small domestic sounds of a fire burning steadily in the stove and something in a pot giving off the faint percussive sound of a very low simmer. The space was 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, and curved above him, the ceiling a warm reddish brown. It smelled of pine wood and wood smoke, and something savory he could not immediately identify. He stood in the middle of the floor and turned slowly because there was nothing else to do, while his mind caught up to his senses. The notebook was open on the small table columns of numbers, dates, temperatures, wood counts. He looked at it longer than he looked at anything else. He had come here expecting at some level he had not articulated to find evidence of her failure or her suffering, or both, something that would confirm the assessment he had made in November. The notebook was not that. The notebook was the record of someone who had been right about something carefully for months in writing. His knee ached from the fall. He was soaked through both coats. He sat down in the chair, the single chair, without asking because his legs made the decision before his manners could intervene. He looked at the stove, small, efficient, radiating a heat that permeated the space evenly, without the strained quality of the fireplaces in his house, which produced intense heat near the hearth and comparative cold everywhere else. He looked at the thermometer hanging on a wooden peg near the door. 63 degrees. His house, with two full fireplaces running for 6 days, had not cracked 50 degrees in any room except the one directly adjacent to the fire. This space, with one small stove burning at a moderate rate, was 63 degrees. It had been 63 degrees, the notebook suggested consistently, through the coldest sustained temperatures the territory had seen in living memory. The question came out of him without decision. James, did he know about this? Did he plan it? Clara had her back to him at the stove. She was ladling something into a second bowl. She had one bowl. She was using the pot lid as a second surface, which was the kind of practical improvisation so automatic it went unnoticed. He started thinking toward it. Her voice was level, carrying no particular weight. The sketch was his. The rest was mine. He looked at his hands, which were beginning to warm and ache with it. James had drawn a sketch. Claire had built the thing the sketch had gestured at. He had spent November through December certain she was going to die out here, and had felt he now understood something close to relief about that certainty, because if she died, it would be the land's fault, nature's fault, the inevitable consequence of a stubborn woman refusing good sense. And he would not have to examine what his offer of $50 or his later offer of $200 had actually been. The notebook made that examination unavoidable. His shoulders dropped. He was not aware of how much he had been holding them until they let go. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, and when he took them away, his vision was clear, and his face felt different, the way a face feels after something it has been bracing against stops pressing. When Clara set a bowl of stew on the table beside the notebook, he ate it slowly, and the warmth of it moved through him in the same way the warmth of the room had not, as comfort exactly, but as restoration, the body's functions returning to normal operating conditions. Margaret, his voice came out rough from the vocal effort of 3 hours in cold, dry air. The children are at the farm. The pipe froze in the kitchen wall. We're running low on wood. Clara looked at him steadily. How low? 4 days at current rate, maybe 5 if we let the parlor go cold. He paused. The temperature's not breaking. I don't know when it breaks. She thought for a moment that was visible on her face, not hesitation but calculation, the same expression she had when she was working a problem in the notebook. There's 3 weeks of wood stacked against the root ball. I budgeted for a hard winter and built-in surplus. You can send Will for 2 loads. Take the sled, not the wagon. The road's not passable for a full wagon. She opened the notebook to a page near the back where she had sketched the property layout. The stack is here. The path to it from the east is shallower grade than the south approach. Tell him to watch the berm edge the drift on the north side. Looks solid, but it's bridged over a gap. He'll go through it if he's not watching. Randall looked at the sketch. He looked at the note about the drift gap. She had mapped it. She had mapped the hazards of her own property for the benefit of people who might need to cross it. He did not know when she had done this, or whether she had anticipated precisely this situation, or whether she simply maintained the habit of knowing her land completely in all conditions. But either way, the practical result was the same. She was prepared for contingencies he had not imagined. He stayed 4 hours. Not by design, the storm intensified in the early afternoon and made an immediate return impossible, and Clara made no indication that she wanted him to leave or wanted him to stay. Simply continued with her day in his presence in the same way she would have continued without it. She read. She added to the notebook. She checked the stove twice and added 1 piece of wood each time with the precision of someone who has calibrated the system. The temperature in the room did not vary more than 2 degrees in the 4 hours he sat there. He left in the mid-afternoon when the wind dropped enough to make the walk survivable. At the door with his outer coat on and his face rewrapped, he turned back once. She was at the table writing. She did not look up. He thought of something to say and then did not say it because nothing he could have said would have been adequate, and he was self-aware enough to know it. He went out into the cold and heard the door close behind him and felt the temperature hit his face like a statement. The freeze broke in the last week of January, not all at once, but in the gradual way of things that have exhausted themselves, the temperature climbing 2 or 3 degrees per day until it reached 10 above zero, which felt almost warm by comparison, which told you something about the frame of reference the valley had been living inside. The damage emerged as the snow receded roof lines that had shifted pipes that had separated at joints livestock losses that people would be absorbing for the next 2 seasons. The community gathered information about itself the way people do after a shared catastrophe, comparing damage as a way of measuring what had happened, as a way of making it real. The story about Randall Hollis taking shelter with his sister-in-law in her log and earth house moved through the territory, quickly carried by Will, who had made 2 wood supply runs and had seen enough to report accurately, and by Margaret, who told 2 neighbors what had happened in the plain factual tone of a woman who had made her peace with the truth of it. By the time Earl Dunmore had heard 3 versions of the story, he understood that the essential facts were stable. Across all of them, the finest house in the valley had nearly failed its occupants, and the woman in the log had been warm. He came to see her on a February morning, the snow still deep, but the sky for the first time in weeks, a hard, clear blue. He brought a loaf of bread he had baked himself and a jar of honey from the last of his summer stock, and he held his hat in both hands when he asked, "May I see it?" She led him inside. He did not speak for the first several minutes. He moved through the space with the slow deliberateness of someone reading something in a language they know, but don't usually encounter. Running his hand along the wall where the grain of the wood showed through the surface, bending to look at the drainage notch in the floor corner, standing directly under the stovepipe penetration, and looking up at the clay packing around it. He pressed his palm flat against the wall, held it there, felt the temperature the wood was holding. He straightened and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just revised a fundamental assumption. "You didn't build on the land." His voice was quiet, working toward something. "You built with it. You made the land part of the structure." She said nothing. He was right, and there was nothing to add to that. He nodded slowly as though confirming something to himself and looked at the notebook open on the table. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "I'll be absolutely damned." He was her first convert, which was the word he used himself, telling people afterward. He did not use it with any religious connotation. He used it to mean I had a belief, the evidence changed my belief, I changed my position. He was the first person in the territory to do that, and it was not nothing, because Earl Dunmore's opinion carried weight in a community where he had been present and reliable and fair for 20 years. The community's formal reckoning came at the March meeting held in the Grange Hall that still smelled faintly of the wet wool of too many people crowding in out of January's cold. The original agenda had been recovery planning, how to account for livestock losses, whether to petition the county for emergency road repair, what to do about the families who had lost use of their homes entirely. Deacon Hartwell changed the agenda without officially changing it, which was a skill he had refined over decades of managing public discourse toward conclusions he had already reached privately. Hartwell was not a cruel man. He was a man with a business and a position in the community and a very clear understanding of which developments threatened both. He sold lumber-milled boards, cut shingles, supplied nails and hardware, and window glass, and everything else required to build a proper house in the conventional sense. He had built a comfortable life on the premise that building required materials. Materials required purchase, and purchase required his establishment. Clara's method, which used a dead tree, nobody owned earth from the ground, creek stone, and one small stovepipe, required almost none of what he sold. If it spread, if people who could not afford proper construction began to see it as a viable alternative, the portion of his revenue that came from the bottom of the economic ladder would disappear. He framed his concern as such concerns are always framed in the language of community welfare. Standing at the front of the Grange Hall with his hat in hand and his voice pitched to carry the reasonable center of the room. He spoke about standards, the importance of maintaining standards of habitation, of not allowing desperation to normalize conditions that were, when examined, objectively unsuitable for human beings. He spoke about hygiene, about structural integrity, about the precedent being set. He did not name Clara directly. He did not need to. The room knew who he was talking about. Earl Dunmore was on his feet before Hartwell had fully sat down. He had the notebook Clara had given it to him the week before, had handed it to him without ceremony, and said he could borrow it for a while, which he had understood to mean she knew he might need it. He opened it to the temperature log for the freeze period and read the numbers aloud, the exterior temperatures, the interior temperatures, the wood consumption per day. He read them in sequence, one entry after another, the dates and times and figures accumulated into an argument that was not an argument, but a record. When he sat down, the room was quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when arithmetic has settled something. Hector Burns stood up next slower, his joints complaining visibly at the change in position. He did not look at Hartwell. He addressed the middle of the room in the voice of a man who has spent a lifetime explaining how physical things work to people who need to understand them for practical purposes. He explained thermal mass in the language of a man who understood it from the inside out. The way stone holds heat after a fire, the way a thick wall of wood behaves differently from a thin one, the way earth at depth stays above freezing even when the surface is at 20 below. He explained why a house designed to sit on top of the land lost heat to the sky and the wind from every surface, while a structure nestled into the land traded heat with the earth instead, which maintained a steady temperature regardless of what the weather was doing above it. What she built is not primitive, he said. Primitive is what fails. What works is what works. He sat down. Randall Hollis had not spoken. The room had been aware of his silence in the specific way a room is aware of the silence of someone whose word carries consequence. He sat near the back, hat in his hands, and his face during Hartwell's remarks had been unreadable, which people who knew him understood as the expression he wore when he was deciding something. When he stood, he did not address the room the way Earl or Hector had. He addressed the floor immediately in front of him, as though the statement was something he needed to say rather than something he wanted anyone in particular to hear. I slept in that house during the freeze. I went there because my own house wasn't holding. She didn't turn me away. A pause. The house was warm. It was warmer than mine. I don't know what to call it except for what it is. He sat down. Hartwell called for a vote on his proposed standards ordinance. It failed to achieve a majority. He accepted this with the composure of a man who knows when a battle is over and when it is merely paused, and said nothing further at the meeting. Outside afterward, he spoke to two men who owed him credit lines, and they nodded in the non-committal way of men who have obligations in multiple directions. The opposition had not dissolved. It had simply lost its public forum, and Clara would have understood immediately that it was not the same thing if she had been there. She was not there. She was at her property, noting the morning temperature in the notebook the first day in 6 weeks, that the exterior reading had climbed above 20 degrees, and thinking about what would need to be done to the drainage course when the snowmelt came in earnest. The timber company representative arrived in mid-April when the road was passable again, and the mud season was just past its worst. He was a young man, younger than Clara had expected, with clean boots and a good coat, and the careful politeness of someone representing an organization that had found over time that careful politeness preceded better outcomes in rural land negotiations. His name was Crane. He had a document case. He sat across from her at the small table and opened the case with a professional deliberateness that was meant to establish the weight of what was inside it. $500 for the full 10 acres. Clean title transfer. They would handle the survey and the filing fees. He presented it as a straightforward offer between reasonable parties. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove. She set one in front of him. She sat on the edge of the bed and held her cup in both hands and asked him which parcels specifically the company needed for their operation. He paused. This was not the usual shape of the conversation at this stage. The timber company's business was the standing timber, he said, on the rear portion of the property. The front section was of limited interest to them from a commercial standpoint. She asked him to specify the acreage. He said 5 acres of the rear 5, which carried the standing timber they needed for the regional operation they were planning. She told him she would sell a 3-year limited harvest right on 2.5 acres of the rear section, not the full 5 and not a title transfer, but a used right with specific terms. No clear cutting, no road construction through the front parcel, access via the eastern boundary only, payment of $180 for the 3-year term with a right of first refusal on renewal at a price to be renegotiated. Crane looked at her for a moment that contained a rapid recalibration. He was young, but not inexperienced enough to miss what had just happened. She had taken his offer, identified the part of it that served his actual need, isolated the part that served her actual need, and proposed an exchange that gave him his timber access without requiring her to surrender anything she intended to keep. She had done this without apparent preparation over coffee, sitting on a pine bough bed in a house inside a log. He countered twice. She made one small adjustment on the access provision and held everything else. They reached agreement in 40 minutes, and she wrote the terms into the notebook in her precise columns before he had finished packing the document case so that there would be a record in her hand that predated his company's paperwork. After he left, she sat for a while in the quiet of the chamber. $180 was not $500. She had known when she made the counteroffer that it wasn't $500, and she had made it anyway because $500 was the price for leaving, which she had decided in November she was not going to do, and $180 was the price for staying on terms she controlled, which was a different category of thing entirely. The money went into a tin box under the floor, stones not the largest of the flat creek stones, but a particular one with a natural lip on one edge that she had set last on purpose so it lifted cleanly. She had planned for the tin box before she had money to put in it, which was the kind of thinking that had kept her alive through the winter. May Garrett came to her on a morning in early May alone, walking the 2 miles from the rented room in town where she and Dolph and their 3 children were living on what remained of their savings after losing the house. May was 26 and carried herself with the straight posture of a woman who has decided that posture is the one thing she can control, and her request was delivered with the same straightforwardness. We need to learn what you did, not be given it, learn it. Dolph is good with his hands, and so am I, and we have until September before we lose the room. Clara looked at her for a long moment, not evaluating her sincerity, which was obvious, but thinking about what the teaching would actually require. She had never explained her process to anyone in sequence. She had explained pieces of it to Hector, to Earl, to Randall in his own limited way, but never the whole of it, never in a form that another person could pick up and carry to a different piece of land and use without her present. Come back Thursday. Bring Dolph. A pause. Bring the children too. They need to understand the land they're going to live in. The teaching began that Thursday in early May with the ground still cold enough at depth to make the drainage principles viscerally clear when she demonstrated them with a bucket of water on a test patch of ground she had prepared. She discovered immediately that teaching was harder than doing not because she didn't know what she knew, but because the gap between knowing something in your hands and knowing how to move it into someone else's hands was larger than she had anticipated. Things she did automatically required examination before they could be described. Instincts built from 2 months of trial and failure had to be unpacked into their component observations before they could be passed on. She was strict about one thing from the first day. I'm not teaching you to build what I built. I'm teaching you to read your land the same way I read mine. Your house will be different because your land is different. If you try to copy my house without understanding why I made each choice, you'll get the shape without the reasoning, and the shape alone won't hold. Dolph was a methodical learner who asked specific questions about load and span and the behavior of materials under temperature stress. May asked different questions about time management, about how to sequence work, so that the most weather-dependent tasks were completed first, about what to do when a planned approach revealed itself as wrong partway through. These were the questions of someone who had managed a household through a hard winter and understood that a plan was only as good as its adaptations. The children came every day that their parents came and ran the perimeter of the property in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes simply the motion of children in open space, which Clara found she did not mind. The youngest, a girl of 4 named Bess, developed the habit of sitting in the root crater when the teaching moved to other parts of the property, sitting in the exact position Claire had first sat in during the previous autumn, back against the packed earth wall, face tipped up toward the sky. Clara saw her there on the 3rd day of teaching and stopped walking for a moment. She did not say anything about it. She kept walking. By June, the Garretts had identified their land, 3 acres of marginal ground 2 miles west, purchased for almost nothing because nobody else wanted it, which was starting to look like a pattern worth paying attention to. By July, they had a fallen oak, not white pine, different properties, different challenges, and Dolph had identified a placement that worked with the natural drainage of the ground rather than against it. By August, the chamber was roughed in. There was a week in mid-August when the work had progressed far enough to reveal a flaw in the original placement that required a partial restart, which Dolph handled with the steadiness of someone who had been warned to expect exactly this. She said a plan is only as good as its adaptations. May reminded him the day he came home from the site looking like a man considering surrender, and he looked at his wife and thought for a moment and went back the next morning. The house was sealed before October. It was not as efficient as Clara's, the thermal mass, slightly less, the insulation less complete, the stovepipe placement, suboptimal in a way that would require adjustment in the spring. But it was functional, it was standing, it was theirs. Clara visited once before winter set in, walked through it, ran her hand along the wall. The way Hector had run his hand along hers, checked the drainage course with particular attention. She did not offer extensive praise because extensive praise from her would have meant less than the single specific comment she left them with. The drainage is right, Hector would approve. She walked home. The evening temperature was dropping toward the first hard frost of the season, and she noted both in the notebook when she got back and added Garrett structure complete. Will observe through winter. The second winter arrived without the drama of the first. That was its own kind of test, the absence of emergency as a condition of endurance. The Great Freeze had given Clara a crucible, a definitive pressure that had either proved or disproved everything she had built, and she had passed through it with data to show for it. The winter of 1884 to 1885 offered no such clarity. It was cold cold. Ordinarily cold, the kind of cold the territory produced every year without comment, and she had to maintain everything she had built without the galvanizing force of crisis to remind her why it mattered. She found she preferred it this way. Crisis was useful, but it was not sustainable, and she had never been a person who needed emergency to motivate her. She was a person who needed problems of sufficient complexity to keep her mind engaged, and the second winter provided those in the quieter register of ongoing management. The stovepipe joint that developed a small separation at the elbow, where the metal had expanded and contracted through a season requiring her to fabricate a collar from a piece of tin salvaged from a ruined food container. The drainage course behaving exactly as Hector Burns had predicted, handling the snowmelt in March without incident, which was the kind of success that looked like nothing happening. The moss beginning to establish itself along the north-facing bark of the log's exterior, which she had not planned for, but immediately understood as a benefit, an additional layer of insulation accumulating without any effort on her part. The land contributing to the structure's performance in a way she had not asked for. She documented all of it. The notebooks accumulated on the shelf she had built into the wall, a simple thing, 2 pieces of plank fitted into a natural ledge in the wood holding 4 notebooks, now the 5th in active use. The notebooks were becoming something she had not originally intended them to be, not just a personal record but a manual, a set of observations dense enough that another person could read them and understand not just what she had done, but why each decision had followed from the one before it. She had not written them with that purpose in mind. She had written them because her father had taught her to observe carefully, and observation without record was just experience which faded while record was experience made permanent. Hartwell's opposition did not disappear after the March meeting. It evolved. He understood as people who operate primarily through institutional means always understand that a public defeat is not a permanent one. It is a setback in a longer engagement, and the appropriate response is to find a different lever. Through the spring of 1884, he had been largely quiet, which Clara registered as more concerning than noise would have been. Quiet from Hartwell meant he was locating the lever. He found it in the form of county tax assessment, but not until the spring of 1886, by which point 3 ground pine structures had been completed in the territory and a 4th was under construction. Only then did the threat to his business become concrete enough to motivate action. A county assessor arrived at Clara's property for what the official notice described as a routine reassessment of all non-standard structures in the district. The assessor was a young man named Prewitt, who carried his official discomfort visibly in the way he held his notebook at a slight distance from his body, as though he was not sure he should be writing anything down yet. He had clearly been briefed by someone on what to expect and what he had been told, and what he found did not match, which made him uncertain about his methodology. He walked the exterior of the structure with Clara beside him, measuring and noting his face, cycling through expressions that ranged from professional neutrality to unconcealed curiosity. He had assessed barns, houses, a granary, a mill. He had no category for what he was looking at. The structure did not fit the definitions in his assessment manual, which had been written by people in the county seat who had imagined all possible structures and had imagined them wrong. He stood in front of the door, the solid plank door in the end of a log framed by the curved earthen walls of the sunken entrance, and looked at it for a long time. "I'm going to need to see the interior," he said finally with the tone of someone who is not sure seeing the interior will help. She opened the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. He looked at the thermometer at the notebooks on the shelf at the stove and its pipe at the carefully maintained floor of creekstone. He wrote things down. He measured the ceiling height, the floor dimensions, the wall thickness at the door frame. He tapped the wood with his knuckle at several points, which told Clara he was testing for soundness by sound, a method that would give him accurate information, which she appreciated. He spent 2 hours on the property. When he left, he said he would file his report with the county office and the assessment would follow. She asked him what category he intended to use. He paused at the gate and consulted his manual without finding what he was looking for. "Dwelling," he said with the tone of a man who has decided that if the word fits nothing else, it at least fits this. The assessment that arrived 6 weeks later placed her property at a taxable value slightly above the town average for comparable acreage, which was the outcome Hartwell had presumably intended, an assessment high enough to strain her resources, perhaps high enough to make the land financially untenable over time. She sat with the document for an evening working through the arithmetic, then wrote to the county assessor's office disputing the valuation methodology on the grounds that the structure's construction cost, which was a matter of public record, given that she had purchased almost nothing beyond the stovepipe and the door hardware, could not support the assigned value. She attached 2 pages of itemized documentation from the notebooks, dates, materials, costs. The dispute process took 3 months and consumed more of her attention than she wanted to give it, but it produced a revised assessment at a lower figure, one she could sustain on the income from the timber lease combined with the small amounts she had begun to earn from teaching. Hartwell heard the teaching spread. His response was to begin circulating through the informal channels he was practiced at using a version of events in which Clara's success during the freeze was acknowledged, but framed as unrepeatable an accident of her particular site conditions, a combination of factors that could not be generalized into a method. He was not entirely wrong about the site specificity point, which was the frustrating thing. Every ground pine house would have to be adapted to its particular land, and the adaptation required judgment that not everyone possessed. He used this truth as a weapon, suggesting that families who tried to replicate Clara's approach without her specific talents were taking a dangerous gamble. Two of the families who had come to Clara for instruction were delayed in their building by this campaign, not stopped, but delayed their confidence, shaken enough to make them pause and reconsider, which cost them a building season. Clara heard about this from May Garrett, who reported it with the flat anger of someone who recognizes a tactic she cannot directly counter. Clara's response was practical. She began accompanying her students to their sites during the critical decision-making phases of construction, not to make the decisions for them, but to be physically present when the doubt was loudest, which turned out to be a more effective intervention than any argument she could have made from a distance. By the autumn of 1886, Hector Burns's health had declined to a point where he was spending most of his days in the sleeping alcove beside the forge, his joints having progressed beyond the management he had applied to them for years. He continued to work on small projects, repair items people brought to him, tools he could finish sitting down, but the substantial physical work of the smithy was behind him. Clara visited him twice in October, bringing food on each occasion and staying long enough to talk through the problems she was currently working on, which she understood was not just social maintenance, but something he needed: the ongoing evidence that the knowledge he carried was still in circulation, still doing work in the world. On her second October visit, he was lucid, but slow, his voice carrying a fatigue that was not the tiredness of a long day, but of a long life approaching its boundary. He looked at the notebook she had brought and asked her to read him some of the entries from the past month. She read temperatures, drainage behavior, the moss coverage on the north face of the log, which had reached full coverage by September, and was performing as insulation in a way she had begun to quantify by comparing winter temperature readings from before and after its establishment. He listened with his eyes closed, his breathing steady. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You'll keep teaching." It was not a question. The ones who come after you need to understand that the knowledge is the house. The actual structure is just the proof. She sat with that for a moment, understanding it the way you understand something that was already true before you heard it said. She said she would. He nodded once. The small, precise nod of a man who considers a matter settled. He died in February of 1887 in the sleeping alcove in the night his forge banked low beside him. Earl told her in the morning, coming out to the property on a day when the cold was sharp, but manageable, a normal cold, nothing like the freeze. She received the information without visible response, thanked him, went back inside, and sat at the table without opening the notebook. She sat there for an hour. She did not pray. She had not been able to locate prayer since James died, but she held the fact of Hector's death in her mind with the same attention she gave to everything she considered important, which was the closest thing she had to ceremony. Then she opened the notebook and wrote his name in the margin of that day's entry with the date and went on with the work. She attended his burial standing at the back of the small gathering, leaving before anyone organized into the post-service gathering at the Grange Hall. She had said what she needed to say in October, and the rest was formality, which she respected but did not require. May had become, without anyone designating her as such, the practical intermediary between Clara and the families who came seeking instruction. She had a way of translating Clara's precise data-driven explanations into language that reached people who were frightened by numbers but understood physical demonstration, and Clara recognized this as a skill she did not herself possess and made use of it without either of them needing to formalize the arrangement. May would accompany her to news sites, handle the initial conversations while Clara was reading the ground, then draw the family in toward the technical explanations gradually rather than leading with them. The partnership produced results that Clara, working alone, had not. By the end of 1887, 7 families in the territory had built or were actively building ground pine structures. 3 of them were on land that conventional assessment had considered worthless. Hartwell's position during this period shifted from active opposition to a kind of strategic withdrawal. He was still present, still influential, still capable of redirecting a credit line or a community vote if the stakes were high enough. But the accumulation of evidence had moved the center of gravity in the community away from him on this particular subject, and he was too experienced in the mechanisms of influence to keep pushing against a current that was strengthening. He redirected his energy toward other matters, road contracts, a proposal for a new county school, and confined his commentary on Clara's methods to private conversations with people who already agreed with him, which was the natural endpoint of an argument that had lost its public audience. Before long, he began quietly stocking the stovepipe and hardware that the structures required, understanding that if he could not prevent the method from spreading, he could at least position himself to supply the parts of it that required purchase. Clara heard about this from Earl with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that precedes one. Earl laughed outright. "The man will survive," he said. "He always does." Clara conceded this was probably true. Survivors were useful. She had reason to know. It was a May morning in 1888, nearly 5 years after Clara had stood at the property line in November cold and refused $50 from Randall Hollis. She was in the entrance courtyard replacing a section of the earthen berm wall where frost heave had shifted a stone out of position. Routine maintenance, the kind of work that a living structure required continuously, which she had come to understand as the condition of the thing rather than a failure of it. Randall's wagon came up the road. He pulled it to a stop and climbed down, and this time he stepped across the property line without hesitating, walked through the entrance. Courtyard stood near her while she worked without speaking immediately. She waited. She had learned to wait for what Randall actually meant to say rather than what he said first. "Margaret wants to visit." His voice was careful in the way of a man managing a number of things at once. "She wants to see the house, she's not asking you to teach us anything. She just wants to see it." A pause in which he was clearly continuing to think. "She had a bad time this past winter, not the house was fine. But she's been different since the freeze. She's been thinking about things she didn't used to think about." Clara set down the stone she was positioning. She looked at Randall, who was standing in the spring sunlight in the entrance courtyard of the home he had tried to buy for $50 on the land he had driven past without stepping onto, and she thought about the specific texture of what it cost a man like him to say what he had just said. Not the words were simple enough. The cost was in the acknowledgement embedded in them that his wife had been changed by an experience that had originated in his failure to maintain his own house, and that the place his wife wanted to go to think about the things she was thinking about was the home of the woman he had tried to erase. "Sunday is fine," Clara said. "Tell her to come in the afternoon when the light comes through the south window." He nodded. He looked at the berm wall she was repairing at the stone she had set down. "Can I help with that?" His voice had no performance in it. He meant it as a practical offer, and she heard it as one. She showed him how to seat the stone in the existing channel so it would hold through the next frost cycle without needing to be reset. He did it correctly on the second attempt. They worked along the berm together for an hour without speaking much, and when the section was done, he looked at it with the expression of a man who has done a small thing well, which was not nothing. On the walk back to the road, something had loosened in how he carried himself. He stopped at the gate and looked back at the structure, the moss-covered log, the earthen walls, the wildflowers beginning to establish themselves along the top edges of the berms. He had offered $50 for this, then $200. He had spent years certain it would be a grave. He said, "I should have looked at the land the way you looked at it before I made James any kind of offer." His voice was level, not confessional, simply stating a fact he had arrived at on his own schedule. Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead. "You would have had to know how to look," she said. "You can't see something you don't have the framework for yet." She was not being generous. She was being accurate, which in her experience was more useful than generosity in most situations. Margaret came on Sunday. She was 43 and carried the recent winters in her face, not aged exactly, but sharp in the way cold sharpens an edge. She stood in the entrance courtyard, first looking up at the log's exterior, at the moss covering the north face in a solid green blanket, at the wildflowers that had established themselves along the top edge of the earthen berms, yellow and white, moving slightly in the afternoon air. She stood there longer than most people did, long enough that Clara understood she was not looking at the structure, but at something the structure made her think about. Inside, Margaret moved slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything. She looked at the thermometer at the notebook shelf, at the precise arrangement of the few objects Clara owned, the cooking tools, the lamp, the mending kit, the books that had accumulated over 5 years through trades and gifts and one careful purchase. She stood under the curved ceiling and looked up at the grain of the wood, which showed through the surface in the reddish-brown patterns Clara had been looking at every day for years, without stopping to see them the way a first-time visitor saw them. "It's not what I thought it would be." Margaret's voice was quiet, not uncertain, but considering. "I thought it would feel like being closed in." She looked at the south window, where the afternoon light came through the small glass pane and lay in a warm rectangle on the stone floor. "It feels like the opposite of that." Clara poured coffee. They sat Margaret in the chair, Clara on the bed, and talked for 2 hours, which was longer than Clara usually spent in conversation with anyone. Margaret asked questions that were not about construction, about solitude, about how to maintain a sense of self-direction when the people around you had a fixed idea of what you should be, about what it felt like to have been certain of something when everyone else was certain of the opposite. These were not questions Clara had been asked before in those terms, and answering them required her to look at her own experience from an angle she hadn't used, which she found interesting in the way she found most problems interesting as an occasion for precision. She said at one point something she had not planned to say, but which emerged from the conversation with the quality of something that had been waiting for the right question. "I wasn't certain in the way they thought I was certain. I was certain about the principle, but I spent every day doubting the execution. The doubt was useful. It was what made me check everything twice." Margaret looked at her across the small bow, the afternoon light changing the angle of shadows in the chamber as it moved west. "I think that's the part nobody tells you," Margaret said slowly, "that you can be right and terrified at the same time, and both of those things are true simultaneously." Clara thought about that. She said yes, exactly that. Margaret left in the early evening, the light going gold across the valley, the spring air carrying the smell of thaw and new growth. Clara stood at the entrance to the courtyard and watched the wagon move down the road, and then stood there after it was gone in the particular stillness of early evening on her land. The wildflowers on top of the berms moved in the small wind. She went inside and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the afternoon temperature. She wrote Margaret Hollis visited. 2 hours. Then she added one line below. She asked the right questions. The years that followed had the texture of a thing that has found its proper motion. The timber company's access crew came through each summer under the terms of the harvest agreement, working their allotted acreage without exceeding those terms, and Clara used their annual disturbance to reassess the rear portion of her land, noting which species were filling in the gaps, how the light was reaching the ground differently where new growth was establishing. The land was changing under the careful pressure of limited use, becoming something different from what it had been without becoming depleted. Earl Dunmore kept a running count in his ledger, noting each new ground pine structure with a small notation that was not officially part of his business records, but which he maintained anyway in the same impulse that leads a person to document something they understand to be significant before the significance is widely recognized. He showed the notation to Clara once on a winter afternoon when she had come to resupply. She looked at the list of names and locations, families she had taught directly, families May had worked with one family in the far north of the territory that had heard about the method through a chain of 3 intermediaries, and had written Clara a careful letter, asking for guidance, to which she had written back 4 pages of detailed instruction, the first time she had done the teaching entirely in writing. She studied the list for a moment, handed the ledger back. Keep counting, she said. Earl smiled, the expression of a man who intended to do exactly that. By 1897, years after the November morning, she had stood at her property line with nothing but a canvas tent, the composition notebooks numbered 9. The ninth was half full. She had established over those 7 years a record of the thermal behavior of her structure across every season and every kind of weather the territory had produced, which was a longer and more complete data set than existed for any conventionally built house in the county, most of which had never been measured at all. She had begun in the winter of 1889 to write a more structured document, not a notebook of observations, but something that moved from observation toward principle, from specific instances toward the general understanding that underlay them. She did not know what to call it. She was not sure it was finished. She kept writing it. 14 ground pine structures stood in the territory by that spring. The transmission of knowledge had moved one generation past its origin. The Webbs had completed their structure the previous year with minimal instruction from Clara because they had learned most of what they needed from Dolph Garrett. This was the thing she had hoped for without being certain it was possible, not a technique she held and administered, but a principle that had escaped her and gone on its own. Clara May Hollis spent her remaining years on the land, on the notebooks, on the teaching, on the ongoing project of understanding a system so well that she could explain it to anyone who was willing to listen. She did not remarry. This was not a choice she made dramatically. It was the quiet result of having organized her life around a set of requirements that she had worked out for herself and finding that the organization worked and not being willing to disrupt something functional for reasons she could not make as precise as the rest of her thinking. The solitude she lived in was not loneliness, which she had learned were different states, that some people confused because they could both be present in a person sitting alone in a room. Loneliness was the absence of something needed. Her solitude was the presence of the right conditions for the work she wanted to do. The uninterrupted mornings with the notebook, the long afternoons on the land, the evenings with the lamp and the books, the specific pleasure of a problem that required sustained attention without interruption. On a morning in October of 1890, she sat on the threshold of the entrance courtyard with her coffee, watching the valley. The log's exterior was almost entirely covered in moss. Now the green so established it looked deliberate, as though the land had decided to claim the structure back slowly and gently, incorporating it into the landscape rather than surrounding it. The wildflowers on the berms had seeded themselves across seasons and now grew in a band that followed the curve of the entrance walls, a line of color in spring and summer that in autumn left behind dry seed heads that rattled softly in the wind. From the road, a person who did not know what they were looking at would see a green mound with a door and a window smoke coming from a point that seemed too low to be a chimney, the whole thing reading more as a feature of the terrain than as a structure placed upon it. She could see from where she sat the faint smear of smoke from 2 other households in the valley. The notebook was open in her lap, the current day's entry not yet written. She was watching the morning rather than recording it, which was something she allowed herself, occasionally the observation, without the documentation, the experience before the columns. The temperature she would write down in 10 minutes. The wind direction she had already noted mentally. The wind moved through the root crater behind her, and the sound it made was the sound she had heard on the very first morning of November 1883, before she had built anything, before she had refused $50 and stayed through a winter that nearly broke the valley and taught herself a method and taught it to others and watched it travel past her reach. The same sound. Older than her presence on the land by a decade at least, the landscape making its own music from its own wreckage long before she had arrived to listen. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Below it, she wrote the temperature, the wind direction, the sky condition. She wrote 7th autumn, structure sound, drainage performing, moss coverage complete on north and west exposures. She looked up from the notebook. 2 smoke threads in the valley, the wildflower seed heads moving, a bird she had been hearing for years without conclusively identifying, a persistent low call from the scrub pines going about its business in the north section of her land without reference to her presence, which was its own kind of endorsement. She wrote one more line in the notebook below the day's measurements in the same plain hand she used for temperature and drainage and wood consumption. What a person discards as ruin, another, with different eyes, can build a life inside. She considered it for a moment, then left it there, because it was true, and true things were worth recording, and she had 7 years of practice knowing the difference between what sounded true and what was. She closed the notebook. She finished her coffee. She went back inside.